Good afternoon and welcome to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department's Feedgrounds, a challenge we can take on webinar question and answer session. I'm Scott Edberg, I'm the Deputy Chief of the Wildlife Division, and I'll be co-hosting this session with you today along with Tara Kuipers. I'll have Tara introduce herself in a moment. This afternoon we have several Wyoming Game and Fish employees, as well as our federal partners from the National Elk Refuge, the U.S. Forest Service, and National Park Service will all be present and all who play a role in feed ground management in Wyoming. All those will be available today to provide information and answer your questions as we move through this session. With that, now I'd like to ask Tara to take the reins and get this session rolling.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Scott. We're going to go ahead and share a couple of informational pieces to help you have a good experience in today's Q&A session. And again, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Tara Kuipers, and I've had a chance to work alongside the Wyoming Game and Fish as we've been offering these phase 1 meetings on Elk Feedgrounds. And today's session is specifically designed to be a question and answer session. Several of you are joining the webinar today that maybe had participated and attended one of the live meetings that happened in the first week of December. Some of you hopefully have watched the recording of those live meetings. As you noticed in those live meetings, we had a lot of great information and presentations that were shared on the overview and the history of feed grounds, on disease, and then on the federal relationships with the Elk Feedgrounds programs. And so we hope and expect that everyone that's here today in this Q&A session has come with having watched that recording or have attended one of the prior sessions. And this is really a session designed to focus on your clarifying questions. So in the live sessions, we had time after each presenter, as well as at the end of the session overall, for you as interested members of the public to ask your questions of the presenters and panelists. So if you're only able to watch one of the recorded webinars, you didn't get to have that same live interaction to get your questions answered. So that's what today's session is designed to do. So we're not going to be offering those presentations again. They won't be repeated. You're welcome to watch that recording at any point. It will be live on the website for a time. But what we really want to offer up today is an opportunity to have your questions answered. So I'm going to share a few items on how we're going to make this session flow. And then we're going to actually dive into that Q&A opportunity. So a couple of things I also just want to mention, as Scott said, thank you so much for joining us. This is such important information and such an important topic. So we're just so glad we have people interested and you're able to join in today for this Q&A session. So a couple of notes on the technology that we're using. We're delivering this Q&A session via Zoom, and you've joined this meeting muted. If you're a participant in this meeting, you've joined muted. As we go a little bit farther in just a moment or two, you're going to have the opportunity to ask your questions by unmuting yourself. You should all see a raise hand button somewhere on your screen. If you're on a laptop or a desktop computer or a mobile device or tablet, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask questions of our panelists. Your video, however, will remain off during the entire meeting. So you can know that we'll only be hearing your audio when you unmute yourself. We won't be starting your video as a participant. I'd also invite you to keep an eye on the chat box. It's likely on the bottom bar somewhere of your screen. We're going to be sharing some links and some information out with you on providing comment via an online form in just a moment or two. So do keep an eye on that as well. But as you can see on the screen in front of you, if you would like to ask a question, we're going to ask that you click that raise hand button in just a moment. You'll then have the chance to mute and unmute yourself, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question of the panelist. If you're joining us by telephone, you can push the *9 button, and that will raise your hand if you're just joining by phone, and then unmuting yourself with *6. So I'll keep these reminders up so that we make sure we have those offered up to you when the time comes. So here's how we're going to move through the sessions. For those of you that watched the recording and had an opportunity to learn the information shared in those presentations that were recorded, we're going to move through a Q&A kind of in the same order that those presentations went. So you noticed if you watched that recording session of the session or attended one of the sessions, we started out with a presentation from John Lund on an overview of the Wyoming Elk Feedground program. So when we start our Q&A session, we're actually going to start with Q&A that might be specific to John and the content of his presentation. So we'll start with questions first on that overview of operations and history of Elk Feedgrounds. Then we're going to move to a chunk of question and answer on diseases. So we're going to bring in two of the presenters that you heard from in that recording, Hank Edwards and Brandon Skurlock, and they're going to field any questions that you might have on diseases. And so we'll spend some time making sure your questions get answered there. And then we're going to move into Q&A from our federal partners. So we're going to bring in the federal partners who are here with us today. And again, invite your questions that are specific to them and their relationship to Elk Feedgrounds. So we're going to move through this question and answer kind of in those three chunks. And then we're going to also have time just for bringing all of our panelists into the discussion to field any final questions that you have. So our goal today is that we make sure we have time for you to get the questions answered. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be including information in the chat box as today's sessions goes on. And one of the things we are going to be sharing with you is the link to provide comment via an online survey or via the regular postal mail. That is really the crux of what we're trying to gain through phase one, is making sure we have your comments in your own words able to be gathered in this process. And the two ways that we have to do that are through that online form or by mail. We're taking comments now through January 8. And so in order to be as informed as possible when you make those comments, we really want to offer this Q&A session as an opportunity to make sure you're clear on all of the information that's been shared out in phase one. So when you provide those comments in one of those formats, you'll have an opportunity to do so with all of your questions answered. So again, thank you for being here today. We're so glad we have the opportunity to share this Q&A session with you. And then as mentioned, we're going to start with the Q&A opportunity on the first set of discussion topics that were part of the phase one meetings. And that is to be inviting John Lund, and we're also going to have Brad Hovingay join him. And so we're going to take some time right now for anyone who has questions related to their topic specifically. So again, their topic is really related to Elk Feedgrounds operations, history, some of the challenges and benefits, broadly speaking, with Elk Feedgrounds. So I'll give a quick reminder that when you're ready to ask a question, you can push the raise hand button, and that will give you an opportunity to raise your hand, and we'll make sure to unmute yourself, and you can ask that question verbally. If you're on the phone, you can push *9, and that will be your opportunity. So I'm going to go ahead and have John and Brad, if you go ahead and turn your video on, we'll get you guys on screen, and we'll focus them first of all on this first round of question and answer. So if you'd like to ask a question on the first topic, the feed ground overview and operations and history, you can go ahead and push the raise hand button. If that isn't working for you functionally, you can put a question in the chat box as well, but we'd love to hear from you verbally as well. So it looks like Brian, I see you have your hand raised, and so you should now be able to click your unmute button. And Brian, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, is there any chance that we'll ever get the alkali feed ground up and running again, or is that never going to open again?
Yeah, I can address that. So, we've agreed with the Forest Service to phase that alkali feed ground out, which hasn't been a big deal for us because those elk have typically just gone to patrol cabin. And in recent years where we were feeding there, we haven't fed very many elk at all. And so it was a way for us to kind of downsize operations up there and meet some of the needs that the Forest Service were asking for. And so it's not likely that we'll continue to feed there, but we really don't need to. We've got other places for those elk to go.
Yeah, I disagree because they're now they're coming down onto my property on our ranch. So without the alkali feed ground, it makes it tough. I'm feeding some of those elk, you know.
Okay, we can certainly address that. So, yeah, so certainly work with your game warden on that, and we can address that. But probably not much chance of alkali being used again.
Great. And Brian, if we can, by registering for this, we have your contact information, but you're also welcome to reach out at any point to your game warden or to someone that's any of the emails that you received, and we'd love to make sure you get that right connection. So Brad, thanks for fielding that. And Brian, thanks for the question. Let's see. What other questions? I'll check to see if anybody else is raising their hand at the moment. I'm not seeing any other hands raised. And again, if you do have a question, we'd love to have you raise your hand, unmute yourself, and that way we can get those questions fielded. If you do have a question you'd like to put in the chat box, you can do that as well, and we'll have somebody keep an eye there. And let's see, I'm not seeing any others right now. So we'll give it another moment or so, and then we're going to move in just a moment to some Q&A time on the disease topics. And so when we're sure we don't have anything lingering out there for Brad or John, we'll go ahead and shift our focus. And again, we'll bring these guys back again toward the end if there's anything to close off with. So I'm not seeing anything in the chat, and I'm not seeing any other hands go up. So I think Brad and John, thank you guys. You're off the hook for the moment. And now we're going to have Hank and Brandon join us. If you guys want to go ahead and turn your video on, we will go ahead and bring you guys into the spotlight, literally, for a moment. And this is going to be now an opportunity for those of you who were able to be part of one of the earlier meetings or view the recording. Hank and Brandon both shared information on wildlife diseases. Hank in the overview and several different diseases of note to this issue of elk feed grounds, and then Brandon specifically on brucellosis. So based on the information that you gained from those presentations, what questions do you have that are related to disease? And again, the same drill, you're welcome to go ahead and push the raise hand button, and we can unmute you or have you unmute yourself, and you can ask that question. And then if you do have one that you'd like to put in the chat box, it does look like we have a question in the chat box. Mark, if you want to go ahead and field that for us, that would be great.
I'm sure this one's directed towards Brandon. Brandon, what are the elk densities or elk per acre on feed grounds?
That's a good question. Hey, Bill. Yeah, so it varies, as you know, on state feed grounds. There's a recent publication, I believe Eric Cole was on it, where they did some density calculations on the refuge. So I won't speak to that. We might ask Eric to touch on that a little bit later. But on state feed grounds, it varies. You know, most our state feed grounds average 500-600 head, all the way up to a couple thousand, you know. And it varies too by the feeding area we have on each feed ground. So I know I'm kind of dodging the question here, but it varies. And it varies year to year as well, based on elk numbers at each particular feed ground and how much snow we have and how big of a feeding area, which we try to maximize every year. So it's variable.
Okay. Brandon, thank you for that. I see a hand raised, and we're going to go to that. It looks like Mark Newcomb. I'm going to go ahead, and you should now be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for putting on this Q&A session. Good to hear from you all, Brad and John and Hank and Brandon. Maybe two questions. The first question would be, can you give me a reminder of what kind of studies you have in place to monitor not just brucellosis anymore, but CWD as well? You know, are we going to see publications such as those that are published by the USGS and things like that on kind of the prevalence of CWD, as well as you know, spread rates and transmission rates and things like that, mortality rates? And then you know, back to the densities, I was wondering if you could give us kind of a maximum density that you've seen during, I don't know if it would be periods of extreme weather, the harder years when more elk are coming down and really concentrating on the feed grounds.
All right.
Maybe I'll give it a shot, Hank, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong. So, and in terms of what we have going on feed grounds related to CWD right now, we have been for the past 8 years taking the genotype of the elk on our feed grounds. And this is basically, there's some genotypes, and Hank, you're definitely have more experience with this than I do. There's certain genotypes that live longer once they've been exposed to the prion. So we're trying to get those ratios and how those ratios might change in the future with CWD prevalence coming. Another thing that we're doing on feed grounds right now is surveillance. So pretty much any elk that dies on a feed ground, or we ask our feeders to try to contact us with the goal that we get out there, we get that animal tested, we ideally remove that carcass from the feed ground, although that doesn't always happen. Logistics can sometimes be a nightmare in that regard. But I anticipate as the specter of CWD becomes more prevalent on feed grounds, since we just found one, that we will be more involved with removal of carcasses of suspected CWD animals from the feed ground and taking them to approved landfill. Hank, did I get that right on the CWD PRP genotype?
You did. You covered that well. So that is ongoing. We're currently working with the University of Wyoming and National Park Service to work on some of those elk genotypes. In addition, we also do a lot of surveillance, not just the targeted surveillance that Brandon just mentioned, as far as looking at those animals that are found dead on the feed ground or just simply ill. But we also do a tremendous amount of surveillance through hunter-killed animals, obviously. And if you're interested in some of the information that we have as far as the distribution of CWD, as well as some of our past surveillance reports, those are all available on our website. I think that my contact information is also available on that website, but feel free. You can call me here at the office. That number is 745-5865, and I'm happy to discuss any of our surveillance programs that we have with CWD.
Okay, thank you.
And Mark, in that regard to the elk density on feed grounds, as I mentioned earlier, it varies among feed grounds. I think in 2016, 2017 at Del Creek Feed Ground in Bondurant, we had one of the highest densities I think I've seen, just because of the amount of snow we had that winter. And we had roughly 330 elk on the feed ground, and we were probably down to about 10 acres of available feeding area. Those elk do not stay on the feeding area, 24/7. They do kind of move up into the timber on that particular feed ground. But at times, we had 330 head of elk, in a 10-acre spot. So pretty high densities.
Okay, thank you.
And Mark, thank you for those questions. I think we have a couple more questions that have come in the chat box. We'll kind of bounce between the hand raised and the chat box. And so I'll look to Mark again. Mark Goki is working behind the scenes to help monitor that chat box. So Mark, what other questions are coming in on the chat box right now?
Thanks, Tara. Yep, couple for Hank came in. One is, can you talk about live tests? And I guess I'll read the other one while we're here. Do high deer CWD rates equal high elk CWD rates?
Okay, I'll try and address both those. As far as live testing goes for CWD, unfortunately, there isn't any great assays that are currently available. There's a couple different methods. One is taking lymphoid tissue from the rectal area. That seems to work pretty good in deer, but it's not perfect. It works okay in elk too. There's another method where you take lymphoid tissues from the tonsils. Those are about the only two methods that have really been don't want to say validated, but they're currently used now. As other technology becomes available, other testing techniques, there's 2 of them that I can think of right now that actually work to amplify the prion. So as long as you can get a good sample, and that can be hopefully blood will be a good sample type, feces, or even lymphoid tissue. And this new technique hopefully will be able to amplify those prions enough to where they can be detected at a much lower level than are currently available through immunohistochemistry, which is the current method we use. So basically, to answer your question, there just isn't very many good tests or any good tests out there for live animals currently. As far as CWD prevalence in deer as opposed to elk, it's true. Through most of the state of Wyoming, we see much higher prevalences in our deer population than we do in our elk population. And that can be in the same area where those 2 populations overlap. We can see prevalence levels exceeding 30% in our deer, whereas the same elk that are inhabiting the same area may be closer to 10% or maybe even up to 16%. But that's about as high as we see in the state, is about 16% in our elk, much higher in deer. Did that answer those questions?
We'll see. Oh, and Scott, did you have another contribution there?
Yeah, I thought maybe it'd be a good time to chime in and tell folks about the America's Conservation Enhancement Act that passed October 30th of 2020, which was sponsored by Senator Barrasso, which in that legislation, there is going to be a nationwide CWD task force to look at how to address CWD across the nation at various aspects, research, monitoring, collaborative efforts with all agencies. And of course, Wyoming will be a key player in that. So we're looking forward to that task force, and hopefully that'll come out with some good recommendations, findings with regards to more information about CWD and how we can address it both Wyoming and across the nation to minimize its effects.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Scott. Okay. We're going to bounce to one of the questions that we have with a participant with a hand raised. And so I'm going to call on Maggie. You should now be able to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question of Hank and or Brandon.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So this is sort of a theoretical question. If you guys were to start phasing out, stop feeding elk with feed grounds, do you have like an estimated sort of mortality rate? And how would that compare to widespread CWD in herds?
I'll take a stab at it first, and it's a big unknown, Maggie. I think it would be easier if we did have cut and dry numbers, but we don't know. Every feed ground's different, every situation different, every winter is different. But that is the big unknown, that we don't know what this disease is going to do and eventually gets established on feed grounds, and we don't know how many elk we can support currently without doing additional mitigation strategies with the winter ranges that we have now.
Are there available like critical winter ranges for elk to move on to?
Define available.
I guess that's complicated, huh? I guess yeah.
Again, it's variable. I hate to keep saying that, but on some snow years, like the year we're currently experiencing right now, we've got a lot of available winter range. We just don't have that much snow. But up north, it sounds like they have more snow than we do now. So there's probably not as available acreage up, kind of towards that Teton County area right now. But so it kind of varies by year, varies by elk population, varies by, tolerance to elk by landowners. Yeah.
Hank, other things to add there?
No, I'm glad Brandon took that on. I wouldn't have been able to answer it near as well as he did.
Perfect. Maggie, thank you for that question. Were there any follow-up pieces there?
No, that's it. Thank you guys.
All right, thanks so much. We appreciate the question. Okay, we're gonna go ahead now, and Mark, I'm gonna bounce it back to you for anything coming in on the chat box. I think we have a few more related to disease that we want to offer up. So Mark, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Tara. This one probably for Hank has to do with vaccines. There's kind of 3 in 1 here. Are there any efforts to develop vaccines? Is a vaccine technically possible? Is a vaccine a practical management method?
Good question. We have done some collaborative work developing vaccines for CWD. To date, there really hasn't been any success stories. As a matter of fact, in the last trial that we did at our research facility, those animals that were vaccinated actually died sooner than the animals that were the control group. So it's really, really tough to develop a vaccine against a prion, because that prion is the same protein that is found in most mammal cells, particularly of the nervous system. So developing a vaccine that just happens to recognize that little different shape is really, really tough. So there's lots of people that are working on it, but to date, there hasn't been any success stories. Ideally, to get to your part of the question about whether it's even something that could be tried, yeah, ideally, if we had a oral vaccine that could be distributed that was effective, yeah, that would be great. But that doesn't seem to be on the horizon, and in fact, may not even be possible. We've got a long ways for the science to catch up before we're able to develop a vaccine.
Okay, thank you for that. And again, I'm not seeing any hands raised. Again, we'd love for you to raise your hand and ask your questions if you're able. But if not, the chat box is another alternative. And it looks like there's maybe a couple more questions. Mark, what other questions are coming up in the chat box at the moment?
Yeah, with the opportunity for CWD positive elk to interact with cattle, is the potential for a prion spillover into cattle a concern?
It's always a concern whenever, the potential for prions to spill over to other species. There's been a fair amount of work with trying to infect cattle and other livestock with CWD prions. And so far, there's no indication that these have spilled over to cattle. There's no indication that it can happen, but who knows what happens in the future. But yeah, it's always a concern, but to date, there's no science to say it's happened.
Great. Let's see. I'm going to go to hand raise right now. Jackie, looks like you have your hand raised. So if you go ahead and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I have a couple. Hi. I have a couple of questions, and if you don't mind, I think I'll just spill them out. One was the DSA line that I didn't understand how that line was developed. It didn't seem to follow any topography or can you explain that a little bit more? And then I'll have another follow-up after that one.
Okay, so the DSA line first.
I'll try, and Hank, again, correct me if I'm wrong here. I think you, Jackie, you're referring to the designated surveillance area for brucellosis. So that refers to the area where we know that we have elk endemic with Brucella abortus. So that is the area where it is highest risk in the state for it to be transmitted to cattle. And those lines were kind of drawn to best they could, along highway borders. I think there's a county border in there. They're just drawn the best they could to kind of contain the majority of Brucella, potentially Brucella carrying elk in the state.
Okay. May I continue?
Yeah, if you have a follow-up on that, go ahead.
Yes, and then why, I think I remember from the slideshow, a higher prevalence in the Clark's Fork area. So do you have any reason for that? And is that's outside of a feed ground area, right? Those animals?
Yes, that's correct. So the Clark's Fork is out of the feed ground area. Really, where some of our highest prevalence is outside of feed grounds is really closer to the Meeteetse area, which is a little bit to the south. Exactly why that is, why we have such high brucella, there's been several theories there, but unfortunately, a lot of those elk are, again, in some pretty high densities, and that disease is able to be maintained in those populations. I'm not sure I answered your question, Jackie. If I didn't, please don't hesitate to re-ask that.
No, you did. May I have one more question?
Okay, go for it. Yes.
Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And then there was really interesting about the predators, the mountain lions known to prey on CWD animals. I was just kind of interested if there was anything published on that. And then do you do predator control at the feed grounds?
So I'll let Brandon talk about the predator control, but yes, that is published. I believe it is a publication by Mike Miller. And if you give me your contact information, I am happy to send you that article.
Okay.
Great. And Jackie, in the chat box, there is an email address that was added. If you scroll up in the chat box, or we can add it again. If you just reach out, we can make sure you get in touch with Hank to get that resource. And then Brandon, I think part of that was going to go to you as well, Brandon.
Sure. Part two, Jackie, about predator control on feed grounds. We discourage the shooting of coyotes specifically on feed grounds because of their role in removing aborted fetuses, which are the primary vector for brucellosis transmission. So we do discourage, we can't completely eliminate it because they are predators, but in areas where we can, we do discourage the removal of predators around feed grounds.
Excellent. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Great. Jackie, thank you for those questions. We have some other things coming in the chat box, and I think if those of you that are asking questions, again, you're welcome to raise your hand. And then also if you're not able to do that, but we do love hearing those questions. It helps us make sure we're getting the right information from the asker of the question. So Mark, what other things do we have in the chat box that we want to throw out to Hank and Brandon?
Okay, thanks, Tara. This question, what is the best way to wean elk off of feed grounds? And is there ample private public land for them to graze over winter? So a similar second part to that question as before.
I'll take a stab at it. Elk are very adaptable, so we know we can bait them to areas. We've done that in the past. But we usually had a food reward when they get there, and that makes this so difficult that we would need, a reliable standing crop or supplemental feed to get those animals to stay there. And there are multiple ways we could probably look into doing that. And yes, there are some areas of relatively undisturbed habitat out there, and there are options. And that's, one of the things we might look into in phase 2 of this process.
Great. All right. Let's see, Mark. What other things? And while we were transitioning to a new question, if you have the opportunity, we had a question from Brian Cook. Brian, thanks for joining in. And we asked for a little bit of additional clarity on your questions. If you can look in that chat box, and we asked for a little bit more clarity before we throw that out, or if you'd like to just raise your hand and you can ask it directly. So Brian, if you're able to give a little bit more clarity. But Mark, what other pieces are you seeing in the chat box that we can field?
Okay, can some immediate management methods like lower density feeding versus long, dense lines be enacted? What is a worst case outcome if CWD is not managed in terms of projected loss of elk populations in terms on time and loss?
I guess I'm not sure I fully understand the question, so I might need a follow-up. But in terms of the low density feeding, that was basically designed to reduce transmission of brucellosis among elk, specifically elk to fetus contacts. It really wasn't designed with a prion that's, in the soil for a very long time. It was designed for a bacteria that's, fairly frail in the environment. I did get some numbers. I asked Ben to look up for densities of elk when they're in high density feed line situations like the line feeding versus low density feeding. And we can get densities as high as 1 elk per 34 square feet in high density situations. And low density feeding, we're able to increase that space per elk up to 128 square feet per elk. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. That goes back to Bill Long's question earlier.
Great. Thank you for that, Brandon. Okay. Mark, what else do we have?
Yeah, back to Brian Cook had a question that you referenced there, and you did clarify. How many CWD cases have we had in the last 5 years in the state?
Do you have those numbers?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know that I have that off the top of my head. I can say that we've had 450, a little over 450 cases of CWD this year from hunter harvested animals. So that's from our latest surveillance numbers. If that is something you'd really like to know, Mr. Cook, I'm happy to total those up for you, but I can say it's probably going to be in the neighborhood of between 1,500 and 2,000 positive cases in the last 5 years.
Okay. And you said that 450 or so roughly in the past year, that's been in the last season's harvest, correct?
Right. This
So the
past
2020
season. Correct.
Great. Thank you. And Brian, if there is any follow-up there, be sure to reach out and we can get you more totals on your 5-year question. But thank you for that question, Brian, and thanks for the additional info. Mark, what other things can we get to our panelists?
Thanks, Tara. We had kind of a follow-up on the mountain lion question earlier, and was asking, do lions pass the prion, and can other coyotes, wolves, etc., help reduce CWD rates?
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, Nathan Galloway, thank you for this. He put the title of that journal article on lions in the chat box. So there's a link to that journal article. Hopefully that'll do you. If not, please get a hold of me and I'll dig it up for you as well. So thank you, Nathan, for that. As far as prions being shed in the feces, it has been researched both in coyotes and crows. And yes, those prions do survive the digestive tract. Certainly some of those prions are inactivated as they go through the digestive tract. I don't know that it's truly been enumerated how many survive and how many are inactivated, but it has been shown that prions do survive the digestive tract, at least in crows and coyotes.
Thank you. All right, Mark, what other, and again, we'll invite you to raise your hand as well, but we'll stay with a couple of chat box questions at the moment. Mark, what other ones can we field?
So the next question, I'm not sure if it's specific to Brandon or Hank necessarily. I'm trying to kind of parse that out a little bit, but it says, what is the palatability for the department regarding purchasing additional winter range?
We'll bring in our Mr. Edberg as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, that is obviously be a Wyoming Game and Fish Commission decision. Any land that became available, the commission would have to evaluate it based on, department review and then decide if they'd want to purchase that property. But, we would probably look at any and all availability to purchase necessary winter range for elk or other species as they become available. But again, that would be a commission decision, and a lot of things that would come into play, whether they would purchase any additional winter range or not.
Okay. Thank you for hopping in on that, Mark. Or I'm sorry, for hopping in on that, Scott. Mark, what other questions do we have coming in the chat box?
Okay, it was a kind of a follow-up to what we might expect for mortality due to CWD. To clarify the question about worst case outcome, I'd like to understand what would happen if CWD was not well managed. Could we lose the whole Jackson elk herd, or what percentage could be lost and over what time frame?
That's a really common question. Just what's going to happen now? You know, now that CWD has been identified, what's next? And quite honestly, I can't give you a time frame on, you know, how quickly prevalence is going to rise and what that's going to mean in terms of population decreases and things like that. You know, there's a lot of models out there that people have taken some really good data and put out some pretty good models on just what might happen. But in reality, we just don't know what's going to happen. Certainly, as we look at CWD across the state in both deer and elk herds, it's pretty obvious that every herd responds a little bit differently for a lot of factors that quite honestly we don't understand. So it's hard to extrapolate from what we see in other herds across the state and say, okay, this is exactly what's going to happen when you know, with CWD hits those feed ground populations. So yeah, I just don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry about that. It's just very, very difficult to forecast exactly what's going to happen.
Thank you for that, Hank. We have a question from one of our attendees with a hand raised. Oh, and it's Mark. Mark, go ahead. I'm going to make sure you can unmute yourself. Mr. Newcomb, you're welcome to go ahead with your question.
Okay, thank you again.
You're welcome.
So very roughly speaking, we kind of have eastern herds, CWD prevalency there, no feed grounds, and western herds with relatively newly introduced CWD and feed grounds. Can you help me with, and Brandon, I don't want to drive you crazy because you're absolutely right that so much varies from winter to winter, but can you give us a rough idea about the behavior of the herds? You know, I know driving past the elk refuge today, because I'm lucky enough to live in Kelly, they're not feeding yet. And there's a bunch of elk out there, you know, and if I were to guess, it's certainly in the range of 1 elk per 128 square feet, if slightly less. So, you know, they're clearly a big herd, some grouping and whatnot. But I do know that winter conditions are going to group elk together, whether they're on feed grounds or not. But can you kind of give me a sense of what you professionals see year after year on average in terms of the elk behavior over in the eastern part of the state?
And I think I misspoke there, Mark. That low density, we're at 1 elk per 828 square feet. Sorry if I misspoke that.
Oh, I probably misheard it. Thanks for the clarification.
And then Hank can probably speak to the eastern elk herds. I'm really not familiar with that country.
Could you please repeat that question concerning the eastern herds again, Mark, so I make sure I get this right?
Maybe in terms of densities among a herd, could you kind of give me a sense of the spatial distribution of those herds when they're overwintering on their free range? And if it's at all possible, kind of compare that to what it looks like for the herds overwintering on feed grounds.
You know, I'm a lot better lab rat than I am a biologist. Scott, can you address that at all? I don't think I have enough information from my lab rat point of view to be able to answer that.
I don't have exact elk per acre or square mile, but we have like elk area 719 here, south of Casper, Douglas, Wheatley. We have wintering herds of elk of 1, 2,000, 2,500 continually wintering on the same winter range, and just moving around several ranches and stuff. So we do have very high densities of elk throughout winters in the same locations, and which overlap with deer winter range, which also overlaps with high positive CWD areas, i.e. deer area 65 is an example. But actual figures, like I said, on elk per acre or per square mile or densities, I don't have any of those figures, but we do have very high densities of elk wintering together year after year in the same locations.
Mark, does that help inform the question that you were wondering?
I think it does. I think, roughly speaking, you could say that the behavior of herds of elk is not terribly dissimilar, whether they're free range elk or whether they're on feed grounds, until you have one of those exceptional winters like 2016, 2017. Well, even then, again, they might be similar, but I was referencing the higher concentration on the one feed ground just due to the snow depths that year. But that's what I was trying to get at.
Thank you for that question. And thanks again for jumping in on that, Scott. Mark, what other questions do we have in our chat box right now?
Well, it's another one it's fairly similar. Still trying to get at the potential losses of CWD. It says, I'd like to get a sense of what the models show and what other herd loss experience you are aware of.
Okay. Any of that insight?
Nathan, are you able to talk? Because Nathan's was a co-author on one of those articles, as was Eric Cole. So I don't know if either one of you want to address this gentleman's question. Is probably much more accurate than I.
Nate or Eric, if you'd like to accept that invitation from Hank, you should both be able to unmute yourself. All right. Yeah, if either of you would like to chime in on any insights there.
I'll let Nathan go first if he has the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, so I'm trying to unmute here.
We can hear you great, Nathan.
Okay.
You bet.
So my name is Nathan Galloway. I work with the National Park Service, and I have been involved, as Hank mentioned, with some work with the National Elk Refuge, trying to answer this question. And I think the key thing is, there's so many unknowns, but basically what we did was we looked at how elk with CWD in Rocky Mountain National Park, how their survival rate changes. And we basically sort of laid that over the demographics of the Jackson elk herd. And the big question is what the prevalence would become in the Jackson elk herd. That I don't think we can necessarily say how it's going to respond. That was what Hank was referencing earlier. But that model basically shows that at about 7% prevalence in females, that population would basically just be replacing itself, even with the current low winter mortality. And I don't have that number in front of me. Is that number accurate, Eric? It's like 7 or 10%, something like that?
Yeah, it was 7% was the prevalence level. Anything above that, the Jackson elk herd would decline, but that was also in the complete absence of cow harvest. And the other major implication of the model was that current cow harvest levels couldn't be sustained at any level of CWD prevalence.
Quite a few factors in play. Okay.
But I would add, just for reference, there's this discussion about, well, mule deer CWD prevalence, or in many deer species, CWD prevalence can be observed quite a lot higher than in elk, but we have seen in a number of places, like in Rocky, CWD prevalence was observed at about 13%. We have a publication coming out from Wind Cave. CWD elk prevalence was somewhere in the average of 17%. So I would simply add that 7% is certainly it's a disease prevalence that we're sort of in the real world range of what CWD and elk can become in certain settings.
And I'll chip in there, Nathan, that you're absolutely right. Our Iron Mountain herd is above 16% now. So like I said, every herd responds differently for sure. And yes, prevalence can get way up there in elk, at least what we've seen so far.
Okay.
I think I can address the density on the elk refuge question that Mark alluded to as well, if you'll allow me.
Great, thanks, Eric.
We commonly see elk densities on the elk refuge during feeding operations of 1,000 per square kilometer and can be as high as 7,000 per square kilometer when elk are actively fed. And that's the actual area occupied by feeding operations. So those are very high densities. And so the concern is that CWD effects could be magnified in this situation because those densities far exceed those that are documented in Rocky Mountain National Park, which was the basis of this CWD model that we've been discussing. We also have good information from GPS collars that elk contact rates are higher during feeding operations than compared to the baseline. And although snow, does affect elk density and make elk group up more, that effect is half as much as feeding operations. So at least as feeding is practiced on the elk refuge, elk are more dense than they would be in a non-feeding situation. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Well, thanks, Eric, for jumping in on this. And also, Nathan, thank you so much for providing that insight to help with that specific question. We sure appreciate it. Let's see, there's a couple of other questions coming into the chat box that are somewhat related. So Mark, I'm gonna see what other follow-up we might have related to this topic before we move forward.
Okay, sure. And back to the discussion where we were comparing elk in the eastern part of the state versus the western. It says elk in the eastern part of the state winter on windswept ridges, am I correct? Whereas in Jackson, deep snow drives elk behavior. Is that right?
For eastern Wyoming, yes, a lot of those elk do spend their winters on windswept ridges.
So that geography piece to add. Okay. Let's see, we'll go ahead. Mark, what other things in the chat box can we offer up?
Okay. One was, I assume, referring to where we've been watching prevalence in elk herds. The question is whether the prevalence is growing. And if Jackson hits 15 to 20%, what would that do to the herd?
Well, some of our elk herds, like the Laramie Peak elk herd that Scott was addressing a little bit earlier, we've seen that prevalence bounce between 5 and 10% over the last 20 years. But it basically stays right around 5% without too much growth above that. That said, as I mentioned earlier, the Iron Mountain herd is right across the interstate from the Laramie Peak herd to the south. And there we've seen prevalence kind of slowly increase each year. And like I said, this past year, actually 2019, when we did wholesale surveillance on that herd, we were above 16%. So yeah, I would say in some herds we do see it growing, and certainly that's true in our deer herds where we've seen prevalence get quite high. And this past year we were, above 60% prevalence in some of our deer herd around the pavilion area. So that's scary. It doesn't necessarily mean that elk are going to get that high, but it's hard to imagine that. It's be impossible for us to say that it couldn't. So as far as what effect could that have on the herd, if you go back and read that paper that Nathan was mentioning earlier about modeling the CWD on in Rocky Mountain National Park, they felt that at 13% you'd start to see population effects. Different models show different things, as you can see. When Eric mentioned, and Nathan, that at 7% they start to model an effect. So what is 15 or 20% going to look like in the herd? We just don't know, but I'm sure it's going to start to have some significant population effects.
Okay. And Rick, I think is there a related prevalence question there that we want to just tie in here as well?
Yeah, and maybe you hit on this, Hank, but it's asking, is there a limit to prevalence? Do we have any charts that show prevalence growth? Is it straight line or logarithmic, or yeah, that's it.
Well, again, I think that would depend on the herd. Certainly, if you were to follow some of those early discoveries of CWD, this is a disease that stays at a low prevalence for quite some time, and then slowly that prevalence curve takes a pretty steep climb, logarithmic climb, and so prevalence can get pretty high. But what we see is that prevalence bounces up and down. Generally, it increases in almost all of our herds, but it isn't a straight line, right? Sometimes it can drop 5 or 10%, whatever, between each of your surveillance points. So I wouldn't say it's a straight line. And I would also emphasize too that again, every herd's going to respond a little bit differently. I'd like to take on another question because I see it coming up in the chat box pretty frequently, and that is why or how let's see if I can get this phrase right, is the consequences of CWD going to be worse on the herd than stopping feeding? And that's a really good question. And it's really hard to, of course, forecast that. But I think the big difference that makes CWD so scary, if you will, is that because it can remain in the environment, that the longer the herd is infected, the more prions are shed and the more those prions are picked up by the herd. So it's not like you can say, oh, geez, now that CWD has been present in this herd for the last 20 years, man, we've lost a lot of elk. Let's just go back and feed them. Well, I didn't say that quite right. My point is, I guess, is that the long-term effects of CWD are not reversible. It's not like we can just go back and make things right again and then bring in a bunch of extra elk and repopulate the area. It just doesn't work that way when you have a disease that persists in the environment.
Thanks, Hank, for tackling that one. That was one of those questions that was looming out that we hadn't addressed it yet. So you hopped right to it, and I appreciate it because it is one of those looming questions for folks. Mark, what other things do we have left to address in the chat box before we move on to our next Q&A grouping?
I'm just gonna jump to the last question in the chat box by Kendra because it's a follow-up to what Hank was just talking about. And it says not feeding and the elk starving on a bad winter is irreversible too, isn't it?
Yeah, it is irreversible, except, over time that herd's going to be able to build back up. But just like we see with our deer herds across the state when there's a really bad winter. But again, it's a tough thing, man. That CWD just doesn't go away. It's really a tough disease.
Okay. So Mark, any other final questions that we have looming here before we move forward to our next questions with our federal partners and then bringing up our whole panelist group for any final questions? But Mark, anything else here before we move forward?
Sure. Another related question. If you do away with feed grounds, will you still have CWD on the National Elk Refuge?
Yes. I think that, let's say that we did close feed grounds, you're still going to have CWD in the area. You're not going to be able to get rid of CWD with the closure of feed grounds. It's still going to be here. It may not be as bad, of course, and it may not spread as quickly, but yeah, it's still going to be present, just like it's present through 3/4 of the state. I mean, it's well distributed across the state at this point.
All right. Well, Brandon and Hank, thank you for those questions, and for everyone who had those questions that you shared out either with your through the comment box or raising your hand. Thank you for those. These are challenging, tricky issues, and thanks for bringing these questions to the forefront. We're going to move forward now, and we're going to again have time. If there's follow-on questions for Hank or Brandon, we'll make sure to bring them on back at the end. We're going to move forward and invite our federal partners to give the same opportunity. We have folks from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've already had a chance to hear a bit from Eric Cole. So Eric, thank you for hopping in earlier. Eric and Frank Durbian are with the National Elk Refuge. And so we're going to invite them. If you guys want to flip on your video, we'll get you guys set up. We also have Gus Smith with the National Park Service with Grand Teton National Park. And Jim Wilder is with the U.S. Forest Service. And so we'll invite those guys to join in to field any questions. And again, we're going to offer the opportunity to just see if there's questions related to these federal partners specifically on the presentations that they shared in these phase 1 meetings, to just see if there's things we can address with them. And let's see, let me get Jim's video back on there. And then we'll just invite any of your questions for our federal partners. So let's see. And Jim is there as well. And I do just want to note as well that Mark Tonoff, who's with the Bureau of Land Management, was not able to be part of the meeting tonight. We apologize for his absence, but if you do have any questions that are specific to the BLM or for Mark, we can make sure to address those. Either some of our folks here tonight might be able to address those questions, or we can get your question to Mark specifically. So we do want to offer up that opportunity since he is not able to join in. So if there are questions right now for our federal partners with the National Elk Refuge, with the U.S. Forest Service, or the National Park Service, this would be now a time to offer those up. And Mark Newcomb, I'm going to go ahead and let you unmute yourself and go ahead with that first question for this group.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate you all taking the time. So here you all are. I guess we just heard that there's $5 million appropriated for CWD nationwide. Who gets it, and how are you coordinating the research that you're going to do with that?
It's my understanding, at least on the Fish and Wildlife Service end, there was a meeting last week at a much higher level than I'm at, obviously in Washington, D.C., to start the group that's going to start making those decisions and making some of the criteria that the questions you just asked will be based on in terms of the decision process. So I think we're still a little early in that process, but I think it is moving forward, and we look forward to seeing how that all falls out.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thanks for that question, Mark. Any other questions? for the federal partners here specifically on their relationship to feed grounds and some of their agency issues that we want to address. Okay, I am not seeing any more hands coming up right now. There's a couple questions in the chat box that I think are going to be the kind of the fodder for the whole group. Looks like there might be one just coming in. Mark, go ahead if that's one for our. Okay.
Yeah, we just got one from Nate that's specific to the elk refuge, I believe. Could you explain the step down program?
I'm assuming that's referring to the bison and elk step down management plan. That'd be correct. I'll go on that premise. How about that? Unless I hear otherwise.
Perfect. And if there's any clarifications we need there, go ahead and add them for the asker of that question. But go ahead, Frank. I think with that as our premise.
The general premise and phase one of that plan is to reduce supplemental feeding to 5,000 elk on the refuge on average. The premise behind that is that during an average winter, whatever that may be, that with 5,000 elk on the refuge, the native habitat, naturally occurring habitat on the refuge would be able to support that level of elk. And we wouldn't have to feed it all. Again, that's on averages. There's some years where we may have to feed a little bit, and of course, some years where we might not have to. That's the general premise of that. And the way that that will be executed is to start shortening, delaying feeding at the onset of winter when we would normally feed, as well as curtail it earlier at the end of that. That's the general preface. If you'd like to read more about that plan, it is available on our website, and you can get further into the details of that. Part of that also, of course, corresponds to disease control, right? Less elk on the refuge, less feeding, lower density, less disease transmission potential. And Eric, you can jump in if you want to make any more comments on that in detail.
I think you hit the highlights, Frank.
Excellent. All right, Mark, what other items do we have for our federal partners?
Simple question. Has there been any CWD found at the refuge?
You want me to take that, Frank?
Yeah, sure. It's a short answer.
Well, directly, no, because the only positive CWD case from the Jackson elk herd was in Grand Teton National Park. However, because the refuge winters 60 to 80% of the Jackson elk herd, it is very likely that if CWD is in the Jackson elk herd in its entirety, it will be on the refuge as well. That's just going to be our assumption moving forward. And I believe it was one positive case out of over 600 samples, but Hank would have more information on that.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that info. Mark, what other chats do we have?
Also pertinent to the refuge, what are the implications for the National Elk Refuge now that CWD is officially present?
Positive test in the Jackson elk herd triggered us to start implementing, and we're in the early stages of implementing our CWD contingency plan. That's also available on our website for anybody that would like to delve into the logistics of that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Any other questions? There's a couple questions that we may invite once we have our whole group back, all the panelists to kind of join in and field some of those. Any others specific right now to the partners that we have in this section from the National Elk Refuge, from Grand Teton National Park, from the Forest Service that we can field at this moment? Okay. Well, it looks like there's some, oh, Mark, it looks like there's a question. Mark Newcomb, go ahead and unmute. There we go.
Okay, thank you. And I don't want to dominate the airwaves, so I'll get in touch with you guys offline if I have more questions. But can you give me a better sense of a couple things? one, just the level of coordination between you guys. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, in a couple years from now, are we going to see papers with all your names on them as you write up research on the elk and CWD as they're interacting among your various jurisdictions, or how are you coordinating kind of management plans for CWD?
I can just offer it. So at this point, this is a sort of breaking news for us. So I think you'll see coordination start to happen. But we've been in coordination on elk for decades. And so, if I look back to the Bison and Elk Management Plan, that, locks us with the Fish and Wildlife Service on managing numbers of elk and bison. In Grand Teton, not our enabling legislation, but the 1950s legislation that, kind of brought us the rest of the park, which is the, some winter range, but migration corridor of elk. That locks us with Wyoming Game and Fish really tightly on, coming up with objectives for the herd based on elk health. And so I would imagine we are going to be in lockstep as all of us are, committed to this herd. And we're also, it's important to each of the agencies for all different reasons. So that would be my answer.
Thanks, Gus. Any other responses there? Okay, great. Mark, thank you for that question. And I think some of the remaining questions that we're seeing come in might be more just kind of for the group in its entirety, some bigger picture questions. It looks like actually maybe one there for you, Mark. Go ahead. Mark, if there's one there that we want to throw out really quickly before we move forward.
Okay, sure. This one was directed specifically to Eric. You have bull elk die each winter for other reasons. Are you testing those bulls for CWD?
Yes, we definitely are testing them for CWD and have been all along. The most common cause of death for bull elk on the refuge is scabies. And we commonly will get a lymph node sample out of any elk that dies of scabies. And so far, none have come back positive.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for that question, and thanks, Eric. So we're going to now just have some time. There's some questions coming in the chat box that are a little bit broader or more general in nature, kind of big picture. And so we're going to have an opportunity just for all of our panelists to join in, and we can have you guys field some of these final questions. So as our panelists are turning their video back on, we're going to add them into our Brady Bunch picture for a final set of questions that we can just make sure everyone that might have some insight has an opportunity to add those in. So we'll invite John and Brad and Scott as well to just join the discussion, and we can have some final Q&A. So again, I'll make sure, Mark, if you have some questions that we might want to bring to the entire group, and you guys can fight over who gets to respond to them. But we do have some questions coming in the chat box. And again, I would love to invite anyone who would like to ask your question. You can click on the raise hand, and you can ask that question verbally as well. It's just kind of nice to have those questions come in from a voice as well, if you'd like to do that. But otherwise, for some of those in the chat box, Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Tara. I was going to roll back to one from Kenda that has to do with economics. It says, if you let the elk herd die down because you weren't feeding and had to wait for the population to grow back, what would happen to your economy and Wyoming businesses and your income to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department through elk licenses?
Okay. Any thoughts there?
I'll start with it. If anybody else wants to back me up, feel free. But we don't want to see elk die and starve to death and see massive reduced numbers. And so I don't think that's something that we would like to see, regardless of what kind of long-term plan we come up with. And so, but of course, to answer the rest of that question, if there was some significant loss of elk numbers, obviously that would have economic impacts on both the department as well as the local communities and different constituents that use those elk. I don't know if that answers that very well, if anybody else wants to speak to it or not.
Thanks, John. Anyone else have an insight to share there?
Yes, I would chime in and totally agree. And that is why we're working to develop this feed ground management plan, because we have to find a balance, right, between the health of the herd disease-wise and all of the demands and the wants from this herd. Because obviously we can't close all the feed grounds, but we need to come up with some good disease management techniques to prevent this disease from spreading throughout the herd.
Thanks, Hank. Okay. Mark, what other questions can we move into for this discussion?
Okay, one from Steve. How long does it take for elk behavior to change? Example, by reducing feed or time frames. If you could predict the future, what would a full, complete phase plan look like? I presuming that phase out plan look like.
So elk behavior, and then kind of that predicting the future question. So either of those, somebody have a response there?
I'll take the easy part of that, the elk behavior question. Elk behavior can change overnight. We've seen it with bad behavior. When an elk finds a haystack, they keep coming until we fence them out of there or chase them out of there. So elk behavior can change really quick. I took the low-hanging fruit of that part of the question.
So relative to the step-down management plan, phase one's a 5-year phase. And since we're not completely sure what's going to happen as we implement this plan in terms of how elk will react to the reduction in feeding, it's an iterative process. So we're going to evaluate as we do this incrementally and see what happens. And then we will have that information after the 5-year implementation of phase one. And we will hopefully be able to utilize that information to come up with what phase two looks like in terms of the reduction of supplemental feeding on the National Elk Refuge.
Thank you, Frank. Any other additions there? Okay. Excellent. Mark, if you want to keep us rolling on any other questions.
I'll just, one that just came in as a follow-up to that. How confident are you that phase one will have a significant impact?
I'm pretty confident that there's going to be a impact. What its significance level is going to be, I can't predict. That's why, as I mentioned earlier, this is an iterative process. It's an observatory process where we will see what happens as we start to implement this, adjust accordingly, and then we will have the information to determine the significance, not only the significance of what we've done to date within that first 5 years, but we'll be able to use that information to reformulate how to move forward in the most effective manner to achieve our goals.
Excellent. Thanks, Frank, for that follow-up. Mark, what other things do we have coming in our chat box questions for the group?
Yeah, this one from Susan is probably for Hank. Do you typically see clinical signs in CWD positive elk?
Elk can have CWD for an extended time, sometimes for for a couple of years and even longer, quite honestly. But we don't start to see those classical signs, those clinical signs, until the last, say, 4 to 8 weeks, something like that. That's when we start to see, you know, the rough hair coat, losing weight. Again, some of those classic signs like drooling and the lights are on and no one's home. But those, again, those only appear in the last 4 to 8 weeks of the disease.
Question. Mark, other things that we can field from the chat box?
Yep. Maggie has, but she says, I'm aware this is a fairly loaded question, but knowing that starvation is something that elk can recover from, but CWD is irreversible and permanent, why aren't we actively dispersing elk away from feed grounds? This seems like a pretty timely matter that simple observation isn't really addressing.
Well, I'll start. You know, the most immediate concern with pushing elk away from feed grounds, regardless of starvation issues or whatnot, is once they get pushed off of a feed ground in winter conditions, they're going to be a very good chance that they would be immediately into conflicts with agricultural operations, brucellosis issues and damage issues, and quite a bit of what I talked about in the presentation I did earlier. That would be an immediate cause for, or reason for not doing that, I guess.
And I'll continue with that. You know, that's one of our primary purposes with feed grounds is, one, reduce those conflicts from a damage perspective, and then also to prevent, you know, the commingling of elk and cattle. And so one thing that kind of goes in hand with that is, if you go back to the question about elk behavior, when elk learn an undesirable behavior, that is awfully very difficult to recover from. They don't forget some of those behaviors very well, and they can literally take decades to correct behavior that's not acceptable. And so that's why we have to be very careful with changes in feed ground management. And so all those things need to be considered as we move forward with this process into the future.
Thanks, John and Brad. Any other additions there? We covered it. Okay. Mark, what other questions do we have coming in?
Okay. Can bull elk sampling to cow sampling give an index on CWD rates?
Not sure I quite understand that question. I may need a clarifier, but I do see earlier in the chat box, Bill, that you asked, do bull elk tend to have a higher prevalence rate of CWD? And the answer is no. In the herds that we have in the state, we see an equal distribution of CWD between both the elk, both the bulls and the cows. It does tend to affect those animals that are prime age, the 3 to 5 year olds most. That is similar to what we see in deer, in that it affects the prime age animals. But with deer, we see prevalence rates that are about twice what they are in does.
Okay. Thank you for that, Hank. Mark, are there any other things in the chat box that we haven't addressed yet?
I'm not seeing it.
Okay. I'm not seeing any hands raised at the moment. And so if there's any lingering questions that folks have, we'll give you a moment to finish typing that in or clicking on that raise hand button. And as you're doing that, we'll keep our Brady Bunch squares up for just a moment. And I'll remind folks that we are going to be sharing some things in the chat box with you. We do have a link for an online survey where we ask for you to have your comments collected. That's the official spot where we're able to collect your comments on this process. And so we'll share a link in the chat box in just a moment. It does look like there is a question. Someone's raising their hand. So Jackie, I'm gonna go ahead and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have Thank you. A question. I submitted online comments and they were long, and are you really reading all those, and are the biologists reading those? And then the second question, second part of that is, how does this work? Do the biologists make a recommendation to the commission, and the commission follows that science or whatever, or how does that process work when it comes to making these management plans? Thank you.
Great question on the process. So I can share with you just the first part of that, and then I'll turn it to any of our other leadership that want to address kind of how the planning will take place. But we are reading all of the comments. They haven't been passed over to the entire committee yet. We're waiting until that Friday deadline when we have them all collected and we can have a chance to kind of put them all into one package, but everyone will have that opportunity to take a look at the comments. And we've been receiving them since early December. So we're in a process of getting that underway. So Jackie, you will have your comments reviewed and read by multiple members of this group. And then those comments will be integrated into a broader planning process. And I'll see if Scott or anyone else wants to give a little bit of insight on where it goes from there.
Sure. So yeah, so as Tara said, we'll take all the comments, we'll put together a report. This committee will review the report, put a final report together. That report then will be presented to department leadership, and then ultimately to the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission, with the goal is that we move forward with a phase 2 process, which will be, could be a 18 to 24-month-old process. What that looks like, that's what part of this phase 1 is about, where the phase 2 process will actually be the meat and potatoes of starting to put together a long-term feed ground management plan, at which that time will be lots and lots of opportunity for public engagement from our internal wildlife managers, as well to the vast variety of external publics that are engaged in this feed ground issue. So we're not even close to making any management decisions or changes to feed grounds until this whole process is completed, and we do have a long-term feed ground management plan developed, which is ultimately need to be approved by the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Jackie, for that question on that process. And in the questions that we are asking folks to respond to, Jackie, you'll note that in the questions and the survey link that was just added to the chat box, part of those questions are how you recommend we do move forward into those phase 2 pieces of the process. So thanks for asking that, so we can offer that clarity. This is truly the beginning of the beginning. Mark, other questions in the chat box that we can offer up?
Yeah, we did have another one come in from Kendra, and it's referencing the presentations that we've provided online on the Game and Fish website. It says, in the presentation you guys posted for us to watch, one of the reasons for feeding elk was to keep them from competing with moose and deer. If we move away from having feed grounds, will the moose and deer suffer because they will be competing with elk?
That's certainly a concern that we would have, especially, in this Pinedale country, this southern part of the region here. The winter ranges were the bulk of our sublet and Wyoming range mule deer herds spend the winter. They would most certainly see some increased competition with those elk. And typically when elk and deer compete, elk win. And so we do have certainly do have some concerns on that extra competition and potential impacts to mule deer on those winter ranges.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to just do another quick check. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. Mark, anything else in the chat box that we want to offer up for our panelists?
I'm not seeing any questions. There's been a lot in that chat box, and I've been trying to follow it. And so if I've missed something, please raise your hand out there. But right now I'm not seeing anything new.
Okay. Well, we're going to then just begin to wrap up. If there's anything that is lingering, I know that in the chat box, we have had a couple of different times an email address get referenced, and that is something we would invite anyone to take a chance to inquire in that email address. But the post right above that in the chat box, if you're able to see that, that is really the one we want to direct your attention to. That is the link to offer up your input on phase one. So we tried to offer through those phase one presentations that you were able to watch either live or via recording, and then the questions that you had here tonight, to offer up just a good baseline of information so that when you offer those comments, you do so from a really informed place and you have that baseline knowledge. And that was our hope by doing these presentations and offering this Q&A session. So that link in the chat box would bring you to a survey. There's also an opportunity to submit written comments by mail, and you'll see that as well. And then there's a website where we are going to be keeping you posted on all of the information that continues to unfold as we go through the next steps of this phase and then future phases. So on that note, I'm going to just invite Scott Edberg. Scott, if you have any final thoughts as we're concluding tonight, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you to all the participants that helped us here tonight. Great questions. Thanks to our department employees and our federal partners for being here tonight and providing a lot of useful information. And I really encourage those of the public that attended tonight and those that maybe didn't but are aware of this, that you could pass on to please get us your input through the website and the survey we're asking for, and definitely stay engaged in this process and this topic. It's probably one of the biggest topics for wildlife in Wyoming, if not the nation. And so please stay engaged and be part of the process. And again, thanks everybody for attending, and have a great evening.